WWE loves eras. In many ways, this did start in the late 90s when we had the Attitude, and from there, we just started labeling the place up. I do get it, as it allows you to market things easier and explain where your company is at a certain point of time, plus it's future-proof. A device to continually sing about as and when you need to. It's why everything from 1997 is still admired, because do not forget. If we all agree this time ended in 2001 with WrestleMania 17, that is 23 years ago. A whole new generation has been born, and we're still going on about it, longing for those days. This also leads to teary-eyed memories about the Stone Cold Beer Bath DX with the tank and anything with Sable, which is a bit more difficult these days. But it's been so well immortalized that even new fans speak of this and go, "I'm upset that I missed it." It is held in the highest of all regards. They're in for quite a shock when they do choose to do this, because have you ever decided to watch a random episode of Raw from 1998 to 1999? If you're not offended by at least one segment, you may need to look at yourself in the mirror. It's really bad. Even in 2024, however, the stars are still stars, which is apparent during all of these Raw reunion shows. Think of the amount of new talent that has had to have their ass kicked by these veterans just because they were hitting their own personal highs during the Attitude Era. It took until Raw 30 in 2023 when Triple H and his pals finally realized that not being intimidated by Imperium or the late great Bray Wyatt was probably not helping things move forward, so worried they decided to be. Surprise, surprise, it went and helped our new cast of talent. By accident though, you and I have now fallen foul to the same thing, because all we've done is chat about this, but again, it's the way. Because when you do zoom past Steve Austin shaking hands with Vince McMahon at WrestleMania 17, the WWE enters some very tricky times. They tried to figure out who and what they are, especially because WCW was totally dead. For years the two had been neck and neck, which lit a fire under all of this. And now, the WWE were the only big game in town. It's the same in any business. When you don't have the competition without realizing it, you will begin to rest on your laurels. I suppose that started with the invasion angle, which was not the story fans had hoped for. Revisiting it today, there are some high points, but overall, I don't care what anyone says. It was done so we could make it clear to anybody who was watching that WWE was better than WCW. I mean, here is the evidence. I mean, every war and battle in history has always been rewritten by the winners. But when you do see a super popular babyface like DDP being used as a stalker bad guy to run after The Undertaker, it just doesn't make any sense. It really is the birth of 2 + 2 = potato. 2002 to 2007 is the same in the sense there are some good moments, but overall it's just a little bit murky. A decade or so after we had moved on though, WWE did figure it out. I mean, John Cena, the biggest star from all of this, once talked about ruthless aggression. That sounds kind of catchy. Why don't we brand it as a brand new era? All that does is shine a bigger light on what the Attitude Era was though, because of course we were trying to recreate that. And yes, was the product hot? Absolutely. Was it giving the fans what they wanted? Seems to be. But has it stood the test of time? Absolutely not. We've already touched upon it. You kind of get a bigger sense of this after The Rock and Austin have moved on, plus you do have those real backbones of the promotions who also ended their respective careers. Look at somebody like Mick Foley. He had dedicated himself to making stars, and did anybody really take up the mantle after? I don't think they did. There are exceptions to this, of course, especially when it does come to Triple H and Batista. The chat about Hunter Hearst Helmsley post-2002 is another ongoing debate. When it came to Evolution and Big Dave, you cannot argue it. He was picked as one of the chosen ones, and we did every single thing we could to get him for the top. For every action, there is a reaction, however, and as fans at the time pointed out, this came after WWE had tried to get Randy Orton to mega babyface levels, and had just gone way too fast. Also, what were we doing when the future legend killer was quite clearly better as a heel? It's almost like we desperately needed new top stars to fill this role, so we were picking anyone that looked pretty good. This carries on because WWE almost fired John Cena until they realized he was a can't miss. And let's not forget, when you go back and watch this now, it is less than a year before you hear the boos creep in. Let's not pretend that wasn't fun, but still, sort of sums up the audience. We were all still trying to figure this out. It's why there is so much bottom-of-the-barrel content before the big switch to PG in 2008. The powers that be didn't really know what to do, and as Shock TV had worked before, they should just jump into that again. But honestly, we soon hit those horrendous stories with Booker T, Sharmell, and Kurt Angle, and even Kurt has come out and said this was ridiculous. That's because it was, and trust me, here comes that word again, it's offensive. Some people will still look fondly towards this though, because look, most individuals get interesting through WWE because they are number one, and that totally changes your perspective. If you went from Hulkamania to the new generation, you got confused, and if you did the same with Attitude to ruthless aggression, the eyebrow gets raised. If 1995 is when you found sports entertainment, then hell, you probably think this is the best thing since sliced bread. Even wrestling's darkest tunnels have some sort of a light. If you can rid yourself of that, however, it's clear from 2002 to 2019, WWE was a little bit of a roller coaster. Look at the likes of CM Punk or a Cody Rhodes. They felt so strongly that the industry needed a kick up the ass, they either tried to change it from within or left to totally restructure it. That is an interesting way to look at things too, because while WWE was top of the mountain, many have said they had to manage their expectations, because once you're through the door, it's a whole new game and a whole new challenge. Today, I'm not so sure that is the same. It feels like all creeds are being given their chance. I mean, Tyler Bate and Pete Dunne are being used. That is definitely not happening under Vince McMahon in 2017. Despite all this, however, we're only ever a week away from having a This Is Your Life segment or doing something wacky that's then compared to G-Generation X. This sort of obsession sort of kicked off in 1997. Steve Austin vs. Bret Hart at WrestleMania 13 is still what I consider to be one of the best matches of all time. The big reason for that is the double turn. Now history tells us this just happened on that night because that's the easiest way to sell it. It's not true. You can go back and watch the build today, and Austin and Hart had been teasing this for months. They knew what their job was. The Hitman was doing this since he returned from his mini sabbatical at the 1996 Survivor Series, which I suppose ultimately leads into what was going to happen a year later. You know the one, the Montreal Screwjob. It's been talked about to death, but do you know what we forget? While Vince McMahon would use this to turn himself into the biggest heel of the Attitude Era, moments before Bret walked out, we got the first showing of the iconic commercial that ended with trial-lacing Ma boots. We even had the brand new scratch WWF logo. And can you connect all what we've just chatted about together? You bet your ass you can. And all leads to the 15th of December 1997 Vince McMahon video where he didn't hold anything back. He thinks the idea of good guys and bad guys is passé. Hilariously, this was mostly ignored at the time because the company had teased so many rebrands it had become boring, but this was different whether they knew it or not. McMahon's speech was drowning in buzzwords and critique that did exist throughout the fan base. You know what? Let's just read some of it. This is a conscious effort on our part to open the creative envelope, so to speak, in order to entertain you in a more contemporary manner. Even though we call ourselves sports entertainment because of the athleticism involved, the key word in that phrase is entertainment. The WWF extends far beyond the strict confines of sports presentation into the wide open environment of broad-based entertainment. We in the WWF think that you, the audience, are quite frankly tired of having your intelligence insulted. We also think that you're tired of the same old simplistic theory of good guys versus bad guys. Surely the era of the superhero urging you to say your prayers and take your vitamins is most definitely passé. Therefore, we've embarked on a far more innovative and contemporary creative campaign that is far more invigorating and extemporaneous than ever before. When we say that in a normal voice, even though I did it in a stupid accent, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense. There's also shots at Hulk Hogan, who was with their direct competitor at the time, but this one felt more thought out. WCW can have their so-called old guys. We've got a brand new young talent plan. It also gets better when you learn at this time Vince was still trying to get the Ultimate Warrior back, so he didn't mean any of it. And also, let's not forget what this is. It's McMahon going, everything else you've seen is fake, but this is real. It's never a good approach, and very Vince Russo. Don't go Vince Russo. Either way, it clicked and allowed WWE to shape Vince as a wrestling genius for the second time after the boom in the 80s. That's forgetting everybody else, which is definitely part of the secret. Without Dick Ebersol, you don't get the first WrestleMania. The late 90s needed the likes of Jim Ross and Kevin Dunn, which begs the question why we were so brutal to the former. Go and read JR's book. The sheer agony that the higher-ups caused him over the years were not just going to be laughed off. Behind closed doors, he was given his due, as was Kevin, as Ross discussed on a 2023 episode of his podcast. McMahon would refer to them as his wrestling and TV guy. Without them, things would be twice as hard. Publicly, though, don't worry about it. Without Jim, however, things would have been very different because he went about restructuring the roster when it needed it the most. Of course, they didn't all work, but two of them broke box office records, and that's a good batting average, even more so as the rest of the crew also did their part. He also had to do this despite WCW being the market leader, but still convinced Steve Austin, Mick Foley, and The Rock to come across, plus you had guys like Vader and Mark Merrow. They didn't really click to the same degree, but they were considered gets at the time. Kevin Dunn was also updating the show's look, which was also important, especially because as the changes were coming in, McMahon was insistent on keeping his crass sense of humor. During the 1996 SummerSlam pre-show, TL Hopper found a log at the bottom of a swimming pool and took a bite out of it. You already know what's happening here. Gross-out jokes were just McMahon's things, much as pushing the envelope was part of Vince Russo's makeup. He was the one wanting Sonny and Sable to wear less and less as he edited the WWF magazine, because essentially he wanted wanted bikini images so he could sell his publication to teenage boys. It was actually this magazine too that made McMahon pick up the phone, because aside from the more raunchy approach, Russo would also don a character and write a column where he would book Raw in different ways. Vic Venom was basically the seeds of the Attitude Era in 1994, and the fact Vince was in his 30s sent McMahon loopy. His inner circle was far older than this, and as we saw from the TV, if you hit a certain age, didn't matter what you could still offer, out you go. Russo was good at making the WWF sound cool to a younger audience without being too patronizing, plus it actually focused on the new breed. Razor Ramon, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and Diesel would all be shown holding titles, and they were portrayed as being awesome. Maybe you should watch these guys. That is where this ridiculous Venom persona sort of worked, because that guy leaned towards the heel so we could get them over too. Look how great Owen Hart and Jeff Jarrett are, and boy, this Hunter Hearst Helmsley should keep an eye on him. As mentioned, the creative freedom he was allowed also allowed Russo to pitch his own ideas within these pages, to the point soon it was sold as Vic being banned from the backstage of WWE because he knew too much. Now that's a little bit silly, but it did become quite intriguing. It was also the first time an official WWF publication basically tried to act like they were the Wrestling Observer or the Pro Wrestling Torch. Boy, would they try this over and over again. By 1995, if you read this, you did notice a couple of things, which were: one, the stuff being thrown out there was actually more interesting than what the WWF was doing, as it had become stale, and two, it was a better read than the rest of the magazine. It all led to 1996 when the official Raw magazine launched, because people with power started to take notice, which would also take Vin Russo into this inner sanctum of the boss. Now you can pick your own trigger point, but many people go to the April South Africa special. It looks awful as a travel crew filmed it, and the match after match structure is just dull. And as for the crowd, barely there. WCW Nitro would slaughter it in the ratings, and as the story goes, McMahon threw the WWF magazine across the room during a creative meeting while asking why the real TV product wasn't more like this. It shouldn't have been so surprising, as the real benefit was long-term storytelling, which the WWF had largely forgotten about at this juncture. That and age. We already touched on this, but around the same time, McMahon was obsessed with age, because we had the new generation. And we had those billionaire Ted skits which were making a mockery of WCW's Ted Turner. The idea was that he was hiring old people, so why watch? Look, these weren't very good, and actually probably told you, Hulk Hogan's on WCW now, so you did actually go tune in. It also ignored the most important part, which is the audience didn't care how old Hulk, Randy Savage, or Roddy Piper were, so it took Jim Ross and new hire Vince Russo and his mad take on sports entertainment to try and reverse the trend. These so-called OAPs still continue to draw, although their major con was the fact their shelf life was shorter. That's just life. The WWF could have capitalized on this better too, but they cut their nose off to spite their face. Anytime they went with youth and a new superstar wasn't over within a month, we just started again, and that strategy was never going to work. You could never truly get behind anyone because you didn't have any faith in the product. It's why if you were a hardened watcher, there were 3 episodes of Raw in 95, 96, and 97, where you could see maybe, just maybe, the company did have a different idea about what they could do. Now, of course, the real markers to look out for are live attendances, merch sales, and pay-per-view buys. But as WCW grew and grew and the WWF looked more behind the times, one man went and tied these 3 mentioned Raws together. That is Stone Cold Steve Austin. Surprise, surprise. He is another guy who WWE rewrote when it came to history, because let us be honest, he wasn't a Hulk Hogan or a John Cena type. Daniel Bryan would be more accurate, because Austin had to prove himself to the powers that be that he was the guy. They really weren't sure. He also didn't drop the 316 program and become a superstar overnight. It was the start of things for sure, but it took months to grow, and if anything, he was just a solid replacement for Triple H in that year's King of the Ring, because one Triple H had been punished after the curtain call incident. From here, Steve had to graft, even going to Vince McMahon begging for more time to talk on television, and when he did tell you that he's better than the rest of these idiots, he actually meant it, and damn it, he was right. The real interesting part is that if you do find public opinion during this time, they knew. Most found that Austin had been underutilized since day one, because he ticked all the boxes, and while we don't talk about it much now, he was a savant when it came to pro wrestling. He was way ahead of the curve given his experience. Just go and listen to Paul Heyman talk about a young Steve hitting the ropes. He was mesmerized. Surprise, surprise, Bret Hart saw this a mile away, and as he was wont to do, pitched to work with Austin, which brought us to the Survivor Series and some serious build. It was also when Steve dropped that somewhat famous promo: "If you put the letter S in front of Hitman, you have my exact opinions of Bret Hart." And you wonder why people loved him. It also showed why he was destined to be a babyface, because whether he realized it or not, that was funny. and as the world around him adopted to their own new attitude, they thought this guy was great. He also had justification because he was trying to get under Bret's skin, and let's go back to what we just said. It's so hard to make this work if you can't live it up in the squared circle, but Steve Austin could. That mother could go. Steve also had a side to him that got you every time, which we saw in the October 26, 1997 episode of WWF Superstars. Think of that too. This was a B show, and Austin was still putting it out there. As he saw any TV time as an opportunity, Austin brutally attacked Brian Pillman, giving him the Pillmanizer before it was the Pillmanizer. This is where it was born. Get the chair and shatter the ankle. This was going to be the catalyst to the unhinged episode of Raw where we got a home invasion with a gun, and yeah, it wasn't the best idea. The USA Network was furious at the company for this. They had gone too far. The WWF did indeed hold their hands up at first until the ratings came through. They were pretty much through the roof, and it helped reaction in terms of Steve. I think in this moment a few eyebrows were raised. There was even a reason for this in the sense Pillman had openly said that Bret was the better of the two, and Austin's undoing would be the fact that he was too tightly wound. Don't forget they used to be tag team partners, so Brian knew all about stunning Steve. Other information which doesn't get talked about enough is that this episode of Raw where we did commit a felony was only an hour and got 9 minutes of TV time, or 15% of the entire show. I don't need to tell you this, but that's a lot. WWE also made sure this dominated the whole program, as even during the following matches the commentators kept talking about this, and as far as they knew, Brian was on his way to the hospital. Excuse me, local medical facility. So this was serious stuff in a world that for the last few years had basically been pitched as a cartoon. We sold this like it was legit too, with many people of authority trying to tell Austin to calm down, but he wouldn't. In fact, it just riled him up even more, and what does that sound like? This was going to become his calling card. We then have to jump forward to April 1997 and to a Raw that people still love. Austin was going to continue this run as he attacked Hart, who was already in an ambulance. That man didn't give a flub. Then President Gorilla Monsoon even went off at the rattlesnake, but he wasn't bothered about this either. This was after WrestleMania 13, so we could already see the fruits of our labor. Everyone was cheering the guy. It was too much of a badass. It even tied in as on this evening, Brian Pillman made his return and went after Austin for obvious reasons. But there was a twist here as well. He joined Bret and went heel. I really didn't like this guy. It also meant the two characters of the piece had kept the same roles but just changed alignment, and that is the genius of it all. They didn't start wearing black and telling fans that you suck. Their motivations just shifted, and it was up to you to catch on. The extra layers did indeed come with Bret, who wasn't just upset with Austin, but felt like he was fundamentally going against the values he had upheld for so long. What's worse is the fans were going along with that too. Which brings us to March 17, 1997. The WWF was embracing the wildness at this stage, and that included the world title. After Bret had got the betting of Austin at the Survivor Series, he wanted a shot at Shawn Michaels, who'd won that thing at the Royal Rumble. It meant the Hitman winning the Battle Royal made sense, which was the plan, and Vince Russo overstepped the mark and said outright live on TV that he thought this would happen. Whoops. Vince McMahon was so furious he changed the finish at the last minute, because he did like doing that, which actually worked wonders. This is when Steve got eliminated from the Rumble, but as none of the officials saw it, he snuck back in, dumped his arch rival over the top, and got the victory. I tell you, it was great. This then opened the door for an in-your-house pay-per-view dubbed the Final Four, where Austin now had to face Bret Hart, Vader, and The Undertaker, because he did screw them over. And of course, Hart won this to get us back on course, but still, there was another twist here. The idea was to keep the fans on their toes. I think the real cool part of all of this, when you do go back to the Rumble, is how the Hitman dealt with it, because he was irate. He had lost his Sid Justice thanks to interference, and now the same thing was happening in the gimmick Battle Royal, and he couldn't keep calm about it. Just to light a fire under this, the Heartbreak Kid then announced he had lost his smile and was therefore vacating his world championship, and that caused extra venom. People still talk about this today. Was his knee injury legit? Or was Michaels just reluctant about losing the belt to Hart? It does mean we turn the clock back once again to this Final Four pay-per-view, because given the circumstances, the world championship was now up for grabs, meaning when Bret did stand tall, he was now the damn champion. It truly was a crazy time, given that 24 hours later, we got to Raw, and Bret Hart lost the title to Sid. And why? Because Austin screwed him over again. I mean, this was so good. Steve had even attacked the Hitman beforehand and whacked him with a chair mid-match, so we were protecting people here. And now Bret was really mad, but here's the thing. He had every right to be. Look at the flippin' evidence. As we have seen over the years, though, if you're too loud, people will turn on you even if you are justified. This was amplified because who was on the other side? A not giving a damn Stone Cold Steve Austin, who was like a tiger. He was relentless, and man, let's just be honest, it was really cool. It's why you can start to see how the double turn came about, because everybody had put the work in. I think I said that already, but I'm saying it twice. Austin and Hart were just super smart workers. They knew what way the tide was turning, even if Steve didn't want it. Those in the back would tell him that he is a babyface now, and he'd shut them down. He wanted to be a bad boy. Nope. It was on March 17th where Bret laid down a new marker too as he turned his frustrations to the audience. The only reason people are getting away with these things are because idiots are cheering them on. The fan base had forgotten what was right and what was wrong. There was also a steel cage match on this Raw as Bret and Sid tried to change their WrestleMania plans, but of course The Undertaker and Austin got involved. They had a vested interest here, and they wanted to be on the show of show. It was a touch of genius as the Hitman had this one when Taker smashed the cage door into his skull, so yep, Britney Spears was back. We screwed him again. Vince McMahon, who was but an on-screen commentator at this stage, tried to get a word with Bret too, and this is where we increased the intensity. Hart shoved Vince on his ass, and trust me, this was huge. We'd rarely seen anything like this. Dare I say, it felt a little bit real. Hart's post-match rage was among his best promo work too as he dropped an S-bomb and asked why this kept happening. Because look, he should be the world champion, everybody knows it, and yet for some reason we all keep turning a blind eye. Of course, we then sent out Austin to answer this. Once again, it was just as good. He made it super clear that the fans were allowed to roll their eyes at this because who cares? It could have been Bret versus Steve 3 at Mania for the championship, but somebody lost and dropped the ball, and of course that was you. Sid Taker and an unexpected Shawn Michaels then sparked a huge brawl, which was rare for the WWF at the time, so of course people were talking about this. We had finally made the right kind of noise. It's why we do need to pop back to the new generation quickly, because that style of wrestling is what people were done with at the time. You'll often see it now. The mid-90s were considered just bad all around for the company, but really it was a necessary evil. The shift away from the bodybuilders like Hulk Hogan to dudes like Hart and Michaels was going to need a transitional period, and if you want to call them the scapegoats, I get it. That was their job. I mean, this is the way in 2024. It's not like it didn't work, just look at the industry. A lot of it was still awful as somebody thought having a garbage man as a wrestler was a good idea. But the night and day when it came to the product did help here. The WWF felt hot again. 1997 encapsulated that as we changed the intro and logo as Raw began with fire and metal playing over the top. The vibe matched the output, and that is a powerful tool. It tells people what to expect. It was also a far cry from 1995 where we called the WWF champion the leader of the new generation, which was silly, and we embraced a whole new way thanks to Vince Russo's madness and Vince McMahon admitting that he was the big bad boss behind the scenes. So if you do go and read the WWF magazine, you will start to see the connection. It was needed, as whether it was Michaels, Bret, or even a Diesel, gate receipts were down. So that meant business was bad, which is when actually we did test new waters. Because after Big Sexy had lost his championship to Bret on a pay-per-view, he barged out the next night on Raw, beat a bunch of people up, and refused to apologize for any of it. If you want to call it a work shoot promo, sure, I think that was the idea. It's also why when HBK was beaten up legitimately during a bar fight away from the ring, no one was sure if this was the WWF working the fans or not, and even though they weren't, we were planting some seeds. People within the promotion knew that things were on the downward turn, and after one pay-per-view, McMahon was so upset he threw his headset on the floor and marched backstage. Nash's outburst was welcome though, because it actually wasn't a good guy or bad guy thing to do. It was somebody reacting with emotion, allowing you to choose how you wanted to respond to that. In a way, it was treating you with more respect. Around the same time, we even had HBK acting like he'd been concussed during a match with Owen Hart. This was unheard of, especially back then. The awareness of concussions has grown significantly since, but the fact we did it here could even be argued that it was in poor taste. It was played as real as can be. The connection to all of this is the blurring of the lines, which was a response to what WCW was doing too. They would soon have Scott Hall acting like he invaded World Championship Wrestling and was ready to wage war, and yet nobody knew why he was here. It seems crazy now that our favorite discussed wrestler here, Stone Cold Steve Austin, was often just hanging out in the background during all of this too. He must have seen the role of the tweener becoming more apparent and been desperate to be given his shot. Even when Jim Ross signed him, Vince McMahon gave him a stupid name and Ted DiBiase as his manager, and look, Ted DiBiase is a legend, but it's like buying a Ferrari and keeping it in the garage. What good is that gonna do here? So when you do take all of this and put it in a box, it shows that all the markings for what the Attitude Era was gonna become were there, even when Doink the Clown was doing his thing. We just hadn't fully embraced them yet, and dare I say that's because Austin was the guy to tie this all together. Whatever you want to define this period as, it doesn't work without him. He is the catalyst to make it click, and most follow his lead. Oh, that's what Steve is doing, maybe I'll do it too. Far from just some gold they stumbled across mine, there were hints even when we had gone totally left field. The problem was you had to go out of your way to find them, and fast forward a few years and they were going to be everywhere, as we really did push the envelope to crazy levels. The irony there being that's the part we should forget about, That's a different video for a different day. So with that in mind, let's get back to the star of the show, which is of course the bionic redneck. The one stat I will always throw out there as proof to his success was that if we do take this 1997 period as when he blew up, he was retired by 2002 after WrestleMania 19 and that match with The Rock. That means his run lasted only 5 years and is the definition of living fast rather than fading away. It's not like this was Steve's choice either. His career was cut short after numerous injuries, the major one coming during the year this all started. Because at the 1997 SummerSlam, Owen Hart did drop Austin on his neck with a pile driver gone wrong, something that would cause serious issues between the two. Steve had asked Owen not to do it Undertaker style, and for whatever reason Hart decided to do it anyway. So many people also point to the fact Austin was actually involved in a similar incident when he was wrestling in Japan. The exact same move, this time done by Steve onto Masahiro Chono, saw Chono break his neck. And want to know how that guy recovered? When he was healed, he changed his style to be more of a brawler, as his old technical approach was just too tricky. In case you weren't watching in the late 90s, this is exactly what Austin did as well. Now really that's neither here nor there, but it may have been where the Rattlesnake found his inspiration, because becoming the guy who didn't give a flub both inside and outside the ring is what resonated with the fans. They were sick of fake characters like the Gobbledygooker, so when they were presented with the dude who had shattered his neck and yet returned to light the WWF on fire, well, it was just the most badass thing ever. The fact he fought through all of this added to his allure. It was the same when he beat up cops or did totally outrageous things. Remember when he held McMahon hostage with a gun? Now that would turn out to be nothing more than a toy, but for 1 hour and 50 minutes of Raw, nobody knew that. We were honestly being told that if Steve didn't get what he wanted, he was going to shoot his boss. Nothing was off limits. It helped that Vince himself was the ultimate bad guy, because without that, this doesn't work. You have to be a real piece of crap to not garner sympathy when your life is potentially on the line, and surely it was moments like this when the company knew for sure they had a strike of lightning on their hands. Stone Cold could do whatever he wanted, and people were going to cheer regardless. It turned WrestleMania 15, 17, and 19 into all-timers.
Look at this, it's perfect! Chicago is perfect!
And 16 likely would have been totally different if Austin hadn't missed that due to injury. There's that issue rearing its head again though. Maybe these breaks that Steve took even helped his magic, because some of those comebacks. When he returned at Backlash 2000, you would have thought the King of the World had reappeared. The reaction was thunderous. That's also an area of chatter, because here we are in 2024, and watching a Stone Cold pop collection on YouTube is still commonplace. Even when he arrived from nowhere at Raw 25, the place went nuts and he didn't even say anything. That glass break has powers the likes we had never seen. It's also why the Attitude Era, for me, ends post-WrestleMania 17. Some like to pose a different timeline, but given everything we have addressed, the good guy version of Austin was the money. He was never going to last forever because that's how life works, but in stark contrast to his WWF tenure, what we actually should have done is run the good guy version of Steve into the ground. And yes, it is true that even though X7 was one of the company's most successful shows ever, the numbers were showing a drop-off in other areas. It's not a surprise. The WWF had been on fire for such a long time, eventually that had to drop. The problem was Austin took it personally. It is a needed quality if you listen to the top guys, because you have to be emotionally invested in your character for people to believe, but nobody wanted to see evil Steve Austin. It'd be like your partner telling you they like men with beards when you aren't able to grow one. Your whole world has just been turned on its head. There were also quite literally millions of people who had found pro wrestling thanks to the renegade Stone Cold, so when they saw him shaking hands with Vince McMahon, they just stopped watching. That's not what they wanted, and as they had no historical love for wrestling and had only just really discovered it, they turned it off. No harm, no foul, let's just find something else to do with our Monday nights. Austin himself has now acknowledged this was an error and that we should have ridden the wave, and look what happened a year after this. Creative was so bad in his eyes, he walked away from the WWF for months. He created a whole stink and just shocked people. How on earth had we gone from a game-changing wrestler to that same guy being persona non grata in the promotion? There's every chance this would have happened anyway, because Austin was notorious for wanting what was best for his persona, but at the same time, if the audience had held up better post-Mania 17, maybe this would have sorted a lot of the conversations at the time. I would guess there was a serious amount of regret. The heel turn didn't work. Sort of. Because anyone will tell you the evidence is there that fans weren't interested in corporate Stone Cold, but there was a massive upside with this. It reminded you what an entertaining SOB Steve Austin was. While it doesn't directly tie into the secrets of the Attitude Era, it does elevate them, because the real-life Steve Williams was a hell of a performer. Crazy Austin was laugh-out-loud funny as he gave psychotic hugs and yelled at Kurt Angle. He even broke The Undertaker during the build-up to the WCW vs WWE Survivor Series Invasion show. Everyone but everyone has said that was next to impossible, well, Mark Calloway isn't gonna laugh. I guess it is a double-edged sword because it was a great window into just how good he was as a talent, but also didn't get the eyeballs it deserved. Given what we are discussing today, however, it is more proof that none of the above happens without this guy. He was a once-in-a-lifetime get, and anyone with any sense saw this even when he was stunning Steve. Go and listen to a Dusty Rhodes or a Paul Heyman speak about him. They knew you couldn't not know. Austin himself was so desperate to make this work, he even flopped back to being a babyface before realigning himself with the Alliance, hoping that eventually he would be hated. He even beat the crap out of best friend Jim Ross in his hometown. Eventually, we all knew that wasn't going to click, so what did Steve do? He created a chant that is still annoying people the world over.
What?
I get the fans shouting "what" can be infuriating at times, especially when it's done to wind up those in the ring. But I put it to you this way. Is there anybody else who could have done this? I don't think so. It underlines the connection Austin had with the fans and how well he conveyed all his ideas to any audience. We loved him then, we loved him now. It's why when speaking of the Attitude Era, he is the guy, because not only did he fan the flames, but he was the main representative. I don't agree with the argument that The Rock only got to the levels he did because of Austin, but it absolutely raised him a few notches further. Dwayne Johnson has proved he too is cut from a different cloth, but it's way easier when you get to work with arguably the most important human in pro wrestling history. We'd all want that. These two helped shift the gears in 1997 too, because they were throwing intercontinental titles into the sea, and sometimes even each other. If you find the first Rock DVD that the company ever released, you'll also hear the Great One laugh about the fact that when he did hurl Steve into the water, Austin could have died. The gloves were constantly off during this period, and it's because Austin was leading the charge. Anything goes. Believe in this chaos. He even rewrote what a WWF main event was meant to be after winning the title in 1998, hence why Mick Foley was drafted in as his first opponent. Dude Love was never going to stop the Rattlesnake at Unforgiven, but Foley was a guy who loved to brawl and his chemistry with Austin ruled. If we were going to tell the audience that wild fights were the way now, this was the right pairing, and look at the finish. It is utter nonsense as Vince McMahon is trying to pull a Montreal screw job and Stone Cold himself counts Dude's shoulders for the 1, 2, 3, and that is because the referee had been knocked out. Gerald Briscoe then disqualified Steve for all of these shenanigans, and this was going to be the way for a while. Just utter madness all the time, which worked because Austin made it work. He had that unhinged quality to him. Such was the faith in this approach that Austin as the guy, his first title run only lasted 5 months because we got to Breakdown and did the main event of him versus Kane and The Undertaker. Problem was, Kane and Taker weren't allowed to beat each other, and if anybody had helped Austin, he would have been stripped of the championship. Imagine we did this with Cody Rhodes right now. The internet would be awash with rage. At Judgment Day, Steve was then fired as he refused to play fair as the Brothers of Destruction fought each other, which brought us to the Survivor Series, or the night where The Rock joined the corporation. And why did we do that? Because Stone Cold needed somebody he could fight in the ring, and McMahon needed somebody to wage war with his biggest foe. You could talk this way for most of 1999 too, because the whole thing was always written with Austin being the guy. Everything else sort of just fit into place. And when we remind ourselves of what we discussed earlier and Steve never being figured in, those involved should be counting their lucky stars they fell into this. The alternative future is not as pretty. It's why some people say WrestleMania 18 is an outlier in all of this, because Austin was reduced to a bit role as he fought Scott Hall in the midst of an NWO feud, but we've discussed this. Post-heel turn and then subsequent attempts to balance events out mean things were wishy-washy for a while, plus Steve didn't want to work with Hulk Hogan. After the rocky road he had just traveled, the last thing he needed was yet more controversy, and hey, go and read all the anecdotes when it comes to Hogan versus The Rock. I love that match, but to pretend it was politic-free? Come on now.
Yes.
The real irony of the situation is that if Austin had been the chosen one, we likely don't get here, because even when he became Stone Cold, he was just allowed to do whatever he wanted. If you run that through the machine, he's likely finishing every promo saying, "And that's why I'm Stone Cold." Doesn't really have the same ring to it. As it was, Austin was allowed to think about what he would want from pro wrestling, and he was right on the money. Screw the cartoonish ways of the last few years. People wanted something real, and sure, Steve thought this would make him the ultimate bad guy, but there's always some luck when you're climbing the ladder to greatness. Nobody does it by themselves. Much like Bret and Shawn's influence too, Austin had his own sphere of guidance because the amount of people who have said they wanted to be a wrestler due to what he did. I know that doesn't make any difference to the Attitude Era, but wrestling is cyclical, so without the Rattlesnake, everything you're seeing right now may not exist. Does a John Cena get the bug without him? Seth Rollins, Kenny Omega, Kevin Owens? They've all talked about seeing Steve when they were kids, and Owens truly believes he doesn't get to WWE without a random chat with the man in an airport. airport. Of course, it's the same for anybody in this position because the Hogans, Cenas, Bruno Sammartinos, and Ric Flairs of this world will open the doors for those that were next. But Austin's biggest calling card was that he led the charge during a time where the WWF didn't know what to do. The product sucked, WCW was kicking its ass, and they needed something, anything. Thankfully for them, they found it. World Championship Wrestling soon got dragged into this too, because where did Austin come from? Once more, there is this story that he had to be fired to refine himself because he used the rage of being let go from WCW as fuel for his ECW promos. Paul Heyman had hired Steve to talk when he was hurt because Steve could talk. He didn't care what he wanted to say either, just create some stink. Soon Austin was going to go full cosplay when it came to the stars of WCW, but amazingly that isn't what got him hired in WWE. Not sure Vince McMahon had ever seen Steve on a wider scale. There was no way he was watching ECW. It was Jim Ross who knew he had what it took, so yeah. Don't pretend that Eric Bischoff let somebody go who wasn't living up to their potential. Austin was quite clearly a top-tier talent, but as the older guard didn't want anyone nipping at their heels, nothing could be done. It was a stupid way to book your show. Steve would still find his way to being a United States champion as well as being one half of the Hollywood Blondes, but when he and Brian Pillman became one of the more popular acts, dead. That's right, it was killed because we can't have the new guys doing anything that might outshine the veterans. No wonder he was pissed. World Championship Wrestling releasing him when he had a tricep injury too was just nonsense, especially because now Austin had extra ammo. He believed he did have what it took to be a main eventer, but now he had been fired unceremoniously too. Talk about giving someone a reason to prove you wrong. JR was never that guy and just knew what Steve was capable of, hence why he was also the dude that brought Austin back to the fold after the already mentioned walkout. There was no WWE without the Rattlesnake as far as he was concerned. That's likely why he agreed to have his ass kicked in Oklahoma too, whatever we had to do. With that in mind, it would be quite interesting to know where we would have gotten if Ross was the guy in the Vince Russo position. We've spoken about the impact of having a more edgy product even when Mantor was running around, and that has to be geared more towards Jim's sensibilities. A Mid-South guy, he liked wrestling to be sports-based with a touch of the unknown, which is what we had with the Kevin Nash Stompathon or deciding to act like Shawn Michaels had hurt his brain. I still think that played with the idea of taste, but seeing what would resonate with the audience was needed. Business wasn't doing well and something had to change. Ironically, neither Nash or Michaels would have been able to have filled the boots worn by Austin, which sort of is the point. Let's say Steve never is allowed to start cooking or doesn't even make it to the WWF. Who is the person to grab it all by the horns and do such a good job at the top of the card? A lot of the ridiculousness lower down was sort of accepted. I still think that's what happened. Triple H wouldn't have worked and neither would have The Rock, whereas The Undertaker was far too spooky. If he had given up that gimmick to become the working man, people would have laughed. It would have been way too much. Even the Stone Cold idea was dumb at first. Austin had chosen the name, but it just meant on commentary, Vince McMahon would go, "Oh, the Ringmaster. He is so stone cold." In June 1996, when he first dropped the stunner, Vince was here again to call it, "What a maneuver." Just for your trivia knowledge, the opponent was indeed Savio Vega. The only reason I'm doubling down on this is because it was all Steve Williams. All of it. It's why that chant King of the Ring victory is so important, because the winner had to say something. Austin just chose to drop the 316 line, and from there was no going back, even though we had no clue. This was meant to be the start of a devastating bad guy run. Don't think he wasn't aware of the mud the WWF was in either, or that he wasn't trying to do something different. He was. That was the whole idea. If you can see what's not working and you have something else in your head that feels different, do it, and do it with pride. It's why sometimes these retroactive stories actually don't help. He cut the promo and became the biggest star, ignores all the other work he put in, or how when his program with the Hitman began, they both agreed to shake things up in the World Wrestling Federation. I mean, if they didn't, what was going to happen? WCW can't run away with it all, especially as neither man wanted to go there. I mean, would Bischoff have hired Austin back after this? Not a chance. That's the main reason their Mania 13 double turn special is so good, and it's not due to a fluke. The submission stipulation may have surprised Steve as nobody clued him up, but the rest of it, they knew what they'd done and what they had to do. There was no going back.
I was a true artist.
I suppose we can pull another secret from the Attitude Era as we have got here too, because yeah, some of it was awful. A lot of what we were doing at the top of the card was great because of this dedication to making it feel like anything could happen, but we kept that specific and focused. When you go through the rest of Raw, you've honestly no idea what to make of it. The use of women is just unbelievable and a testament to the likes of Lita and Trish Stratus. To actually be featured as wrestlers, even for a brief moment, is a huge victory, and likely explains why Trish hung up the boots as early as she did. She knew what waited if she did hang around, around. And I ain't even going to get into what happened with Lita's retirement here. It was just so wrong. You also have characters like Val Venus and The Godfather, so we weren't a million miles away from what we had been doing with the new generation. The Sultan and Dean Douglas were the equivalent, and whereas with that one we had a Sultan, obviously, and the other was a teacher, we just raunched it up a few years later and introduced a pimp and a porn star. We didn't get it as kids, but yeah, I wouldn't want my child watching that either. We can go on with the likes of Beaver Cleavage and even Kai and Tai. At first they were just meant to be a group of great wrestlers from Japan, and then they were in a love angle and tried to chop Bao's penis off. That's how one episode of Raw actually ended. And it was great that Vince Russo wanted everyone to be featured up and down the show because it meant they felt like a star, or at least felt important. But would it really have hurt things if we had never learned that Mark Henry's sexual chocolate persona had a sex addiction and once banged his sister? No, it wouldn't have, and we never ever should have done it. It had a really bad knock-on effect too, because once the Attitude Era was done and WWE didn't know what to do, they assumed this is what people wanted. It wasn't. To make sure we keep harping on about it, Austin's real aura is what made it click so well. And yet what happened from 2002? We got Triple H accusing Kane of having sex with a dead body, or Heidenreich threatening Michael Cole with some super illegal things. I still don't know who any of this was aimed for, but I know where it was coming from, a desperation to get back to the top. The fact it didn't fly is because we were also rejigging our main eventers and looking for our top new star. And by the time John Cena had been anointed, what happened? A large portion of the fan base booed him because he was more goofy than the last guy. And look, it did work. That man made so much money for WWE and was a hero too, kids, but the adults that had stayed on wanted an Austin Part 2. A large reason for that is because he was their guy, and everyone has their guy. But even then, they weren't forgiving of what the WWE was doing on the undercard. That's why eventually the promotion went PG. We've gone so far in one direction, let's see what happens over there. At least we'll get some more sponsors, because we're not going to get people to bark like a dog. Again, that was an infamous moment from the Attitude Era and deserves zero praise. And yet when Steve Austin's music hit an hour later, nobody was thinking about that. It was like some sort of weird drug. I'm sure there is still a contingent of people who do advocate for this, but we can just do the normal test. Sit down and show it to someone who doesn't watch wrestling and get back to me. They will be offended that you even thought this was a good idea. You also get the super dumb, like the Big Boss Man killing Al Snow's dog and then feeding it to him, or how Triple H and Stephanie McMahon first got together. The game drugged her and wed her against her will. I know the story soon revealed they were in cahoots, but still, to even skirt around with that concept, my word. These sort of stories were always going to wear thin eventually because it was more about shock than in-depth narratives, but Vince Russo himself has admitted this. He thought to keep somebody's attention you have to throw everything at them as fast as possible. I would imagine Roman Reigns disagrees.
That's right.
It's just so crazy because we were coming from ideas like fake Diesel and fake Razor Ramon. That's why Stone Cold deserves even more credit for leading the charge. He and the rest put so much work in before the boom that we could all see what was happening here. The rest then got slotted in around it, including Goldust. That's all. Just gold dust. And look, Dustin Rhodes is an all-time performer, but my word, there was no boundaries here at all. We could also talk about the matches because none went more than 3 minutes, and again, go and peruse some interviews from some performers who were getting it on back then, and they will tell you the same thing. We couldn't really have a good match because eventually we were told, you have to stop now, and please do hit somebody with a chair. It's why I, for one, do not want the Attitude Era to return in full because a lot of it was bad and all over the place. I mean, if anything, I'm much more interested in finding the next Stone Cold Steve Austin, and I think we have explained as to why this is. So if you have some time on your hands, I highly recommend you go back to this period and watch the Attitude Era come into existence. You'll be surprised just how much was already in place before it was time to go. The biggest shame being the departure of Bret Hart. I still think him staying with the WWF and having his final match with Steve after he exploded would have been absolutely all time. Alas, we will never know. Still, even without that, it captivated an entire generation of humans, and that's never going to change. Ask your cab driver if they watch wrestling the next time you take a ride. I will bet my hair they will tell you they once did when Austin was ruling the world. 20 plus years later, and they haven't forgotten. It just meant he took the company to the promised land, and when he was signed, he wasn't even meant to win a title. It truly is a great reminder that you never know what is coming in this mad thing called life. Your time could quite literally be just around the corner. Now please do like the video, share the video and subscribe, and make sure to leave me a comment below and let me know what do you think about Steve Austin, The Rock and the Attitude Era in general. Maybe you thought it absolutely sucked. There's definitely a conversation to be had. You can also click the video on the screen, which is me again, just getting into the nitty-gritty of sports entertainment. But ultimately, thank you for joining me for this deep dive. I really had a good time, and I hope you had a good time too, and I look forward to chatting to you on the next one.